So welcome everybody to the 6th lecture in the Humanities Research Centre's 2022 Works That Shaped or Changed the World, a lecture series that this year is focusing on religion. Let me begin by acknowledging the elders of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, the traditional owners of the land that the Australian National University is built upon. So our speaker today is Dr. Rayson, a public theologian focused on issues of climate change and justice. Di teaches theology and ethics at the University of Newcastle and also Charles Sturt University. She is the author of Bonhoeffer and Climate Change, Theology and Ethics, published last year by Lexington Books. And she is co-convenor of the 2024 International Bonhoeffer Congress, which is in Sydney. So welcome, Di. You're going to speak for about 40 or 45 minutes, then there'll be plenty of time for questions and answers using either the Q&A function, the chat function, or the audience members can use the raise hand function, and I can ask you to unmute yourself and then you can speak with Di. But please take it away, Di.
Great, thanks very much for that. Afternoon, everybody, or good evening, depending on if you're listening to this in the future at your leisure. I'm super thrilled to be invited to deliver one of these lectures. I've been listening to the other ones, and it's just such a great opportunity to share our ideas. Before I start, I'd just like to also acknowledge that I'm on the unceded land of the Awabakal and Warramai peoples, and I also spend a lot of my time on Biripi country, so most of my research occurs there too. Let me just start off by excusing my throat because I've had one of the lurgies that are going around, not COVID, thankfully, but I'm sounding a little bit unusual, so I apologise for that straight up. I'm going to share my screen for you, and let's talk some Bonhoeffer for the afternoon. So I'm going to assume that you don't know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer or about Letters and Papers from Prison, but I hope to argue the case that this is definitely a work that has both shaped and changed the world. And what I would like to do is talk a little bit about both Bonhoeffer's life and witness, his testimony, including some of the key parts of his life story, that he was a Lutheran pastor, that he was a prophet. He spoke into the times in which he lived. He was a secret agent, and he was ultimately martyred just at the end of the Second World War. And he's got a statue at Westminster Abbey there as one of the modern martyrs of the Protestant world. And I'll also be talking about the letters and papers that have been compiled into a book called Letters and Papers from Prison, and hope to convince you that it really is an important piece of theology that that continues to influence the way theology and a lot of other disciplines are conducted today. Some of the books that you may or may not be aware of that Bonhoeffer's written include Discipleship, which was a big bestseller in the 50s under the title of The Cost of Discipleship. And at the same time, he wrote another book called Life Together. And both of those continue to be really popular in churches and just amongst the general public. They're really accessible. So, excuse me, it's an unusual type of theologian that can write books that remain bestsellers. Another book that you might be aware of is his Ethic, which would have been his most important work, but unfortunately, all we've got are the extant manuscripts that were cobbled together after his death. So his books are collected in this critical edition, the Bonhoeffer Works, firstly in German and now fully translated into English. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer was born into this fabulously wealthy and influential family, born in what's now Poland, but spent most of his life in Berlin, had a bunch of brothers and sisters, and he's that cute little blondie there in the little pinafore with his twin sister, and there was a younger sister born after him. His family was really highly educated, and they all of their friends and wider circle in Berlin were all very influential aristocratic families. And this becomes important later in the conspiracy, because it's this same group of aristocratic people who held influential positions in the military and in other parts of the bureaucracy who undertook to become a conspiracy to remove Hitler, not necessarily to assassinate Hitler, but to remove Hitler and replace him with themselves as an interim form of government until new elections could be formed. So there was a whole process leading up to that moment, and that process was this milieu of these wealthy, well-educated, highly educated people in Berlin. They were also very musical, and there's a photograph there of Bonhoeffer at the piano with his best friend, Eberhard Bethge. Now, Bethge is credited with compiling most of Bonhoeffer's works after his death and releasing them to the public. In the first instance, he simply gathered together the letters that Bonhoeffer had written to Bethge from prison and circulated them amongst the churches in Germany, but subsequently had them published, and then ultimately wrote the authoritative biography of Bonhoeffer, which is still, you know, the sort of ultimate reference on Bonhoeffer's life. It's said that, you know, these musicians in this certain part of Berlin used to get together on a Sunday afternoon and play instruments together. And so there is conjecture that perhaps Einstein was actually a part of this same group of musicians playing together, but we've got no evidence one way or the other. So should you think that Bonhoeffer was an academic, and well, he was, but a serious academic with no kind of humor, this is a postcard from his first church community that he pastored in Barcelona. So he was pastoring a German congregation there, and back in the day, you could have a photograph of your own face superimposed onto a postcard that he sent back home. So he, as well as being an academic theologian, he was very much a pastor, and of the ilk of thinking that theology is for the service of the church, and if not for that, then why would you do theology? And so in that sense alone, you know, that's a really influential way of combining church work and academia. So we've got him to thank for that as well. So he pastored in Spain, pastored in London for a few years, 33 to 35. And during these years, he did a lot of work internationally through the movement that ultimately preempted the development of the World Council of Churches. So his ecumenical work is another significant heritage that we have from him. He was really quite widely travelled in 1924, just sort of in his university days. He did the continental tour with one of his brothers and went to Rome, which was really significant for him. So as a Lutheran pastor, or an up-and-coming Lutheran, the idea of the Roman Catholic Church and all that entails was quite foreign to him. And so going to St. Peter's in Rome really shifted his thinking on the ways humans worship and the accoutrements around that. And that also becomes significant in his ecumenical thinking down the track. This is a photograph that Bonhoeffer himself took in Libya. And from his very brief writings in his diaries of that time, he was really impacted by Islam, which again speaks into his later movements that he does in an interdenominational, interfaith kind of space, he's very interested in visiting and working with Gandhi. There was correspondence between them, and Gandhi had invited Bonhoeffer to come and stay with him on an ashram. That was not to be because of the war, but I often wonder what might have happened had they got their heads together, and I've actually written a paper on that. It was one of my very early papers. He also went to the US, and this was a really important time in Bonhoeffer's development. So photographs there are really just to show you what a sort of good dresser he was. But the significance of his year at Union Theological Seminary in New York shouldn't be downplayed, because it was there he was faced with what he saw was the paucity of the Reformed Church in the US, but instead was really impacted by the Black Church in Harlem, where he ended up worshipping and running a Sunday school class and spending a lot of time listening to gospel music, Black gospel music that he hadn't heard before. Actually taking a whole bunch of records back to Germany with him at the end of his year. But it was at this time his theology really becomes a much more grounded theology and an outward looking theology, very impacted by the social justice movement in the Black church in New York. And so that probably speaks into his later writings on and support of Jewish Christians in Germany, and in fact helping them to escape Nazism. So after his year in New York, he goes back and starts teaching at Berlin University. And one of, I think, the most foundational pieces that he writes are the Christology lectures. So Christology just being the study of Christ. What does it mean? What does being Christ mean? And there's a quote there that that I use a lot in my work of his understanding of Christ, who is human, crucified and risen. And you can't have one aspect of that notion of Christology without the other two. And I've put that there because I think that really is a foundation for all of his later work, particularly the letters and papers from prison, which we're about to get to. But as things are sort of disintegrating in Germany, the church, the Deutsche Christian Church, becomes more complicit with the Nazi movement, and there's a counterbalancing movement called the Confessing Church in Germany that Bonhoeffer was a significant part of. There are several important documents written, declarations, that Bonhoeffer was one of the key authors of. And subsequent to that, he becomes blacklisted pretty quickly, not least because of his radio speech that he gave when Hitler first came to power. Now it's a play on words, but he's talking about the leader who is actually a misleader, and his radio speech is actually cut off mid-sentence. So he's sort of on the radar right from the start of Hitler's rise to power. By this era, the church decides that the only way to continue to train pastors is in an underground seminary. And Bonhoeffer comes back from London for the years 35 to 37 to actually direct and run these underground confessing church seminary at Finkenwalde over in Pomerania. So it starts off in this cute little farmhouse here and moves to another property which is no longer in existence, so there's no photographs of it actually. But this was a really important movement where Bonhoeffer has moved out of the academy and is now fully committed to the church work on the ground, and indeed underground, because remaining complicit with the Deutsche Christian is no longer a viable option for them. During this time, he wrote probably his most famous book, Discipleship, or The Cost of Discipleship. And this is really a riff on the Sermon on the Mount, which has become increasingly important to him. So you might be familiar with, you know, blessed are those, probably you've heard it from Monty Python, blessed are the cheesemakers. But Bonhoeffer is really moved to consider, what does it mean if we actually take that seriously and actually try and implement those things? And so from thinking about the Sermon on the Mount to being engaged in communal living with the brothers, as he calls them, confessing to each other, praying together, spending a lot of time writing sermons, practicing sermons with each other, and preparing to lead the church. As a result of this, he writes Discipleship. One component of that is this notion of cheap grace versus costly grace. So if we enjoy God's grace, we can't just treat it as if it's worth nothing. If it's worth nothing, you know, our sins are forgiven, but we don't actually need to change our lifestyle. It's grace without discipleship. It's grace without participating in Christ in the world. On the other hand, costly grace is costly because it calls us into discipleship. Now, this is really important because this sets up what Bonhoeffer will go on to do in his life witness, and that is make really difficult choices about what does it mean to follow Christ when the decision making is not black and white, when it's not clear what is the good way or what is the right thing to do, but to make moral choices when those choices actually sort of just grey. Very difficult to know, which is probably why the book's so popular still. There was an opportunity for Bonhoeffer to actually escape Germany, or to leave Germany at least, when war was looking imminent. And so he did go back to the US to, you know, jobs that Union Theological Seminary had set up. But this was a real tussle for Bonhoeffer. And in the end, he made the choice to return just 6 weeks later, really, back to Germany with his brother at the start of World War II. And you can see there by reading those notes of his, just what a difficult choice it was, and how the moral imperative to not want victory of the nation if it meant destroying the civilization, but then what does it mean to desire the defeat of the nation for the sake of civilization? So you can see what a complex decision-making process he was going through. Now, you might recall the film The Valkyrie, which is a pretty close rendition of The Conspiracy, or at least the very final moments of this conspiracy of, as I said, these influential people who were actually able to effect change had they been able to remove Hitler. But of course, this final assassination attempt was not successful, and that then subsequently led to the execution of most of the people involved in that. So it's around this time that Bonhoeffer is arrested in April 1943 and spends the rest of his life incarcerated, first at Tegel prison in Berlin for 4 months, not a short time, for 4 months in the Gestapo prison when the conspiracy is becoming more and more clear. So he was interrogated there in the Gestapo prison, then taken to Buchenwald concentration camp, and finally to Flossenburg, where he was executed just 10 days before the Americans came and liberated the camp. So it was such a close thing. That final photograph there is the mound of ashes. So you can see there's a slope in that hill there. Where the executed bodies were chucked down a big tunnel. They were then incinerated, and the ashes were just chucked onto this big pile. And so that mound there is at least twice my height. So from prison, we get these significant writings. That's a photograph there of his actual cell in the Tegel prison in Berlin. And you can see that he's still totally devoted to his academic work, his writing. Prior to his imprisonment, he'd been working on the ethic. He was working in the Abwehr, the military secret service, but using that time to also make contact with churchmen, particularly around the world. And the most significant of those was Bishop Bell from England, hoping to seek the support of the Allies for the overthrow of Hitler from within Germany. But of course, that was seen not to be a legitimate case, according to Churchill. So you can see of the 14 days, he walked for 3 hours, he read, he studied, and he worked. And that's why we've got such amazing material from his prison time. So let's go then. The letters and papers from prison are letters between Bonhoeffer and his family, his fiancée, and Eberhard Bethge, his best friend. So there's a whole collection of letters, poetry, meditations, prayers, reports. There's a book outline. There's a play, there's a fiction, lots of notes for the more ideas that he had. But significantly are the theological letters, which start from April 30th, 1944, and just go for a few months. But they're super stuff. The structure of the collection of letters and papers are in these kind of parts. There's a prologue, which is this piece that he wrote as a Christmas present for his mates after 10 years, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the rest of the collection is according to the period of history, the interrogation period, when he's awaiting his trial, when he realizes that actually it's not going to be a short stay, it's going to be a long stay. Part 3, where they're just hanging out for this final coup attempt, and this is where he writes the really significant material, and also a beautiful letter, thoughts on the baptism of his godson called Dietrich Bethge. So Bethge's son, named Dietrich. And then part 4 is after he finds out that the final assassination attempt has been unsuccessful. These Zossen files are discovered, which implicate Bonhoeffer in the conspiracy, where he realizes that there is no hope, that there's no way he's going to leave prison alive. And in this time, his letters to Maria, his fiancée, really diminish, but his letters and poems to Bethge are maintained. They're being smuggled out with a friendly guard who actually had offered to help him escape, but once the Zossen files are discovered, it's all over at that point, and he realizes that he needs to stay in prison to avoid putting the rest of his family at risk. So after 10 years is an amazing piece of writing, and it starts off with this notion of time. Time is lost, not when I'm in prison, but when we've not lived and experienced things, learned, worked, enjoyed, and suffered. And so he's sort of setting up this whole notion of what the last 10 years of resisting Hitler has been for them. And then there's a series of short paragraphs like who stands firm. And this one I've put here on stupidity, which got quoted so many times during the Trump presidency of the United States, that stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of good than malice. You can protest against evil, you can expose it, and you can prevent it maybe by use of force, but against stupidity, we are defenseless. But now I'm going to hit you with a whole lot of quotes now, but I think it's good to see some of these statements in their own context. And I'll just let you have time to read that what keeps gnawing at me is the question, what is Christianity, or who is Christ actually for us today? So you can see that this, going right back to those Christology lectures at the beginning of his academic career, right through till now, this notion of who Christ actually is and what does that mean when the world is changing around us. How is it that we can be Christians when we're not assuming that people have this religious a priori, that that people aren't growing up with a notion of a Christian heritage, and increasingly as we live in a multicultural space, that, you know, that's more so. So what does it mean to be radically religionless and yet still recognizing the Christ that is at the core of the Christian faith? This is a continuation on of that same letter there. And if you're just reading that, you can see how he's getting quite worked up here about, you know, trying to sort of preach a dishonest and intellectually dishonest kind of Christianity. It's a bit like religious rape. You know, what does that mean for us as a church to kind of plonk a type of Christianity onto a community that sort of has no background in this kind of religious a priori? And then in bold at the end there, how can Christ become Lord of the religionless as well? Is there such a thing as a religionless Christian? If religion's only the garb in which Christianity is clothed, these garbs look pretty different in different ages, then what's religionless Christianity? So you can see in his mind, Bonhoeffer is kind of pushing out to this notion of how do we respond to the transcendent, which is God, or which we might name as Christ, without all the baggage of religion. And in the context of what religion had just done to Nazi Germany, and then in a post-Holocaust age, you can understand what he's trying to do in his head is to get rid of all that, which creates this kind of drama, to get to the real kernel of what does it mean to be people who are God-honoring. At the end of that letter, he actually realizes he's got more time to write. And so there's almost like this part 2 of the letter that's written a bit later. And I'll give you time to read that. So what I think Bonhoeffer is doing is saying what drives him crazy are religious people who kind of want God to step in when there's a problem, or God to step in to solve the issue, like a Deus ex machina, this, you know, magic jack in the box that sort of pops up to save the day. Even to the point in that last sentence where he says, well, look, belief in the resurrection isn't the solution to anything. It's a comforting notion, and that's great. And he certainly wasn't a denier of the notion of the afterlife. But what really grabs him is when we recognize that God has presented as Christ the human, and comes to us in a vulnerable, earthy way that actually changes how we live in this contemporary world, not just what we might dream of in the future. And that's the real kernel of his theology, that it's this worldly, not otherworldly, that it's focused on the here and now, and lets the not yet kind of take care of itself. Also talking about God being at the center of the story, not out there on the edges, not a God of the gaps that just sort of fills in the things for the things that we can't explain. You know, if we can't understand something, then we leave that bit to God. He's saying, no, let's subvert that and put God right at the center, the strength of the community, of our intellect, of all that is good. Let's put God into that space, not out on the margins, because if we leave God to the gaps, those gaps will get smaller and smaller as time goes by, as science, you know, fills in our knowledge space. So God can't be that God in the spaces. God needs to be right in the center. And here again, he's looking at this future growth of the church being something that sort of transcends the difference between Eastern and Western thinking around, you know, the creeds, around how we understand God, that in a future time, without the religious a priori, there'll be a different religionless Christianity, something that's totally different to everything that's gone before. So you can see why this is kind of significant theology. So here I'm paraphrasing another of a later letter, a week later, that God is not a God of the gaps, but rather central to all reality. And in fact, not only central, but the unifier of reality. And so in that sense, there is nothing in reality which is not infiltrated by Christ, and nothing that has not been redeemed and restored by Christ. So this kind of alternative thinking that, you know, there's a tussle between, you know, God and Satan, and some bits are sacred and other bits are not. Bonhoeffer throws that out and says, no, like either Christ is Lord of all or is not Lord at all, and infiltrates the whole of reality and unifies all of reality. So this really changes how the church then can relate to the rest of the world, if they're not seeing the world as the enemy needing to be preached to or redeemed, but rather just to be drawn into the goodness of God. That really subverts a whole lot of ways of being. So to continue sort of paraphrasing, ethical agency, or what we do in this world, is more important than this individualistic question of saving our personal souls. And that's a quote, that last phrase. He also says, isn't God's righteousness and kingdom on earth the center of everything, not God's heaven or future, but rather bringing it down to the here and now? He also said, what is beyond this world is meant in the gospel to be there for this world. So the purpose of an eschatology or a future hope is not to kind of save us out of this world or to provide some sort of escape hatch to heaven, but rather to shine a light on what life in this world, in this time and space, might be like. And he also introduced this notion of a worldly interpretation of theological concepts. So trying to just take the whole bottom out of how we speak about Christianity and religion and faith, and using the world as our starting point rather than using, you know, heaven as the starting point. So that's your busman's tour of some of the key ideas in the letters and papers. Honestly, I've spent the last 10 years reading them, and just, you know, every time I return to them, there's just so much more in there. And so I guess the question is, what really has been the significance of these collection of papers? How did they change and shape the world? And I guess I'm talking about it in terms of the way it has driven a progressive post-Holocaust theology. So Bonhoeffer's obviously just there at the turning point, was aware of what was going on in terms of Hitler's solution to the Jewish question, had been involved in helping a small number of Jewish people escape out of Germany. But in writing his ethic, he's responding to the question of euthanasia, and what he suspected to be the extermination of a great number of people. So his concepts in his theology really have driven this post-Holocaust theology that has developed as we've looked back onto that terrible period of history. He's influenced the way we think about religion in terms like the philosophy of religion from this notion of the unified reality and placing the transcendent at the center of that story, of a center of a unified reality, rather than being external to it. And so that really has spun off a whole new way of thinking about reality from a philosophy of religion point of view. It's had implications for the way we think about religious studies and church ecclesiology, not only from his work in the underground seminaries, the life together discipleship type material, but also his very first thesis was on a sociological interpretation of the church. So how do we understand the Sanctorum Communio from a sociological perspective, and yet still recognize the unification in Christ as being the whole fundamental principle of church. As I've sort of tried to intimate, that the notion of this worldliness, I'm sorry, I've left off one of the inverted commas there. The notion of this worldliness as opposed to otherworldliness is really important. And along with that, the notion of time and space here and now being much more important than some sort of future imaginary or future hope in heaven. And so for me, that has certainly been where I've grounded my thinking around climate change and trying to push back against some eschatologies of, being plucked out of this earth, regardless of if it burns or if it overheats or if it's completely destroyed, and we just all go to, or the chosen just go to heaven, but rather valuing the earth as God's good creation, still restored and redeemed and infiltrated by Christ. So that those notions have been particularly important in my own work. But Bonhoeffer continues to be an important figurehead of interfaith and interdenominational relations. So his early work in the youth movement, the International Youth Movement, that preempted the creation of the World Council of Churches, and his interfaith work, which you can only imagine would have been developed had he gone to India and studied with Gandhi, and Gandhi, of course, being of Jain and Hindu heritage, but also so very interested in Muslim interrelations. You could just imagine where that might have gone had he not been murdered at the end of the war. So if, this has just absolutely delighted you and you can't wait to read some Bonhoeffer, you could start with those books of his that I've listed there. Discipleship used to be called The Cost of Discipleship. Life Together, still two really popular books. If you want to go hardcore right up front, his Ethics was the final book that he was working on. He spent a long time on it in a monastery in Etal, and also continued to write it through prison, but the prison part of the ethic was lost. So we don't have that part of the manuscript. Creation and Fall was one of his early books that he wrote when he did a series of lectures on an exposition of Genesis 1 to 3. And so my own work relies on that a lot, because he sets up this notion of God's good creation never being fully cursed, but blessing and curse just remaining in what we call an ambiguous twilight of creation. So I really love Creation and Fall, but it's not nearly as popular as some of those others. If you were to read a biography, you might look at Christiana Tietz's Theologian of Resistance. Christiana Tietz is a highly esteemed German theologian. Or you might go to Eberhard Bettge's seminal biography of Bonhoeffer, and the reason that we are even talking about this today. But may I suggest that you don't go to the Eric Metaxas book. Eric Metaxas was is a supporter of Trump and has tried to portray Bonhoeffer as a right winger, really, which makes no sense since he was in a conspiracy to overthrow Hitler. But that book is particularly popular in the United States and sort of casts Bonhoeffer in a way that no legitimate Bonhoeffer scholar would actually want. And just to finish up, just some of the contemporary applications of Bonhoeffer. I've got my own book there because, you know, I've used Bonhoeffer to think through our relationship to the earth in this unified reality, the this worldliness of our Christianity as opposed to an otherworldliness take, and also thinking about an eco-ethic, how we respond to the demands of the climate crisis in a way that kind of reflects what Bonhoeffer did in his own life, you know, that sacrificial freedom for others as opposed to freedom for your own benefit. So that's the sort of work that I've been doing. My friend Reggie Williams in the United States is really pushing into Bonhoeffer's Harlem Renaissance kind of come to Jesus moment and thinking through what that means for race relations. Bonhoeffer's been a really significant source of theology for the Truth and Reconciliation movement in South Africa. And that book there that I've put by John de Gruchy, who is one of the sort of second generation Bonhoeffer scholars. So that whole generation of mostly men are in their twilight years. But John de Gruchy worked very closely with Desmond Tutu, and they used Bonhoeffer's theology to develop the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. So you can see that that Bonhoeffer continues to influence not only, you know, us theologians sort of in the academy, but on the ground, what's happening in you know, some of the most desperate questions that the world's facing. And as Ibrahim said at the beginning, we are hosting the next International Bonhoeffer Congress in Sydney in 2024, which is a huge coup because mostly the congresses go to places that are associated with Bonhoeffer. The last one was in South Africa just right before the pandemic started because of Bonhoeffer's influence there. And we in Australia made the case that in a globalized world, you know, Bonhoeffer infiltrates and is important throughout the world. So I heartily invite you to come along to the next Bonhoeffer Congress in North Parramatta in January 2024. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.